Hello and welcome to another edition of Mailbag. What is Mailbag? Well, Mailbag is a feature of the channel where you guys leave lots of comments on the channel and I attempt to answer those comments, or if I can't answer those comments, I throw it out to you guys who have more knowledge on some of this stuff than I do. So let's get into the first mailbag of this session. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. This next question comes from Classic Arcade and Amusement Park videos. And this was in response to after I got an Amiga 500 D70 rotary control mailbag I did in March 2022. And he or she writes, after following the development of the Amiga for 2 years before it came out, we bought one of the original Amiga 1000s. When it did come out, I had an Apple Plus, I think that's meant to be a 2 Plus, and a C64. The brackets are in the wrong place. The thing that really impressed me most about the Amiga was its sound chip. It introduced the world to software synthesis in 1985, almost 15 years before hardly anyone else was doing or using VSTs, and I was incredibly impressed by the keyboard. Incredibly impressed by this and the sampling technology, which, other than the Ensoniq Mirage synths costing $10,000 or more, or synths costing $10,000 or more, things like the Fairlight Synclavier or Emulator 2. I ran a variety of soft synths on my Amiga using a MIDI keyboard, and it was the only computer for many years with this ability. In the 1980s, I even had a soft synth that could emulate Ensoniq Mirage and read the floppy disks made for it on the Amiga's disk drive. I purchased 30 Mirage disks. The Amiga, like the ST, was one of the few computers built around MIDI. All you needed was a $20 MIDI DIN adapter for physical connectors. And this was really true. The hardware was built in, no drivers are required. A full MIDI interface for other computers was much more expensive and required dedicated drivers. On the Amiga, it was purely plug and play. As an easy connect to a joystick, after you bought the computer, $20 was nothing. I saw no advantage to MIDI on the Atari ST, but the Amiga sound chip was worth $1,000 to those of us using the Amiga as a sound module, as I did at the time. I felt the Amiga and Atari were dead by platforms and lost the war to the PC when you got the ST in 1995. Cubase didn't come out until 5 years after the Amiga came out, and the Amiga's audio chip was really special in its first 5 years. After that, we had keyboards like the Corgan 1 with 16-bit sampling, and they didn't cost $10,000, and many bands like mine could afford them. Thanks to the Amiga for introducing it. I'm still heavily into software synthesis. I run them all on Windows machines. I have no interest in becoming a studio engineer and using my computer for multi-track recording. I'm a musician that just wants to play my instruments mainly for live performances and let somebody else use their computer as a tape recorder. I never felt that the element of MIDI was so important. Let the studio people do the recordings and the musicians focus on playing. Right on, brother. The Amiga is a computer that should have been known as the ultimate MIDI computer. It also had a multi-track recording ability. I had four Amigas in the 80s and early 90s, but have completely switched over to PCs by the end of the 90s and run them with my Amigas before that. I have one Amiga 1000 left, but I prefer Amiga emulation when I want to run Amiga software. All these years later, soft synths is still my number one interest in computers. I still do exactly the same kind of things that I did back in 1995, using a computer as a sound module, only it's a PC now. Cubase should have introduced the VST format on the Amiga. They really missed the boat and were late to the game. Also in your video, one of my old guitarists gave me a D70 just a few months ago, I had the usual red glue issues to be repaired. That is a really interesting view of the Amiga. I came basically into it a little bit after the Amiga and Atari ST story, but I was watching a really interesting video the other day which discusses the exchanges of staff between Commodore and Atari during this piece of based in time. Basically, the R&D department of Commodore left to form Amiga. Amiga was bought by, the R&D department of Atari left Atari to form Amiga, which was then bought by Commodore, and the Commodore R&D department were recruited by Atari. It's really quite interesting. There's quite a few videos on YouTube that discuss this. So really, the Amiga really shares more with the Atari 800 and the Commodore 64 than it does actually with, shares more with the Atari 800 than it does with the Commodore 64, if that makes sense. I agree the MIDI integration ports and the hardware was a game changer for the bedroom producer. It really was. As you rightly said, you needed a cable. You didn't need an interface. You didn't need software. You didn't need drivers. You didn't need all that was gone. And the software for the Amiga wasn't budget breaking either. I think the most expensive music software wasn't thousands of dollars. It was hundreds of dollars. But you effectively, what you had then is you had a computer which was MIDI capable, which was music capable, and it was sitting in your bedroom. And it was either a cheap controller, or as you rightly say, you could use it as soft synths. It was as cheap as you could get in the 80s. Now I've been thinking for probably the past year or so about getting an Amiga for the sheer hell of it, but I think that probably will have to wait until funds are available, and the prices of second-hand Amigas are going through the roof on the portals. What I would say about the whole concept with the Amiga is the Amiga broke two barriers really in the sort of the 80s, and it was, as you rightly say, it was so far ahead of the competition at that point in time. Up until sort of 1985, it was Commodore 64. It was in the UK, it was at Spectrum were kind of the two leading brands. In the US, I think you had Tandy machines or Radio Shack machines. I'm not quite sure how they were branded out there. You had Texas Instruments, but you didn't really, that was the 8-bit computer market, the 8-bit computer scene. Apple was quite big, obviously, in the US. It wasn't as big over here. But along came the Commodore Amiga, and it had two capabilities that really stood out. Number one, it had this video chip that was pretty superb. And it was improved on later versions. I can't remember what they were called. They had specific names like Diane and stuff like that. And I probably quoted a chip name that wasn't actually on it. And then they had this sound chip or sound capability. I think the sound and video might be on the same chip. I'm not sure. I'm not really up on Amiga architecture, so. But they had this sound chip that actually, as you rightly say, was a synthesizer in its own right. And could reproduce synthesis at a fairly decent level and at a fairly decent quality. So yeah. Anyway, the other thing is the red glue issue. This stuff is generally quite nasty, I have to be honest. And anyone out there that gets this issue or gets a keyboard that has weights added to it with red glue, if you're not comfortable doing it yourself, get it to a service tech as quickly as possible to get the red glue removed, because believe you me, if it gets onto the circuit board of the contacts underneath it, you could probably kiss goodbye to the key bed.